on the flat green edge of the world's oldest country, where two great rivers run down into a warm and shallow sea, there were people once who could not yet read a single mark, could not trust a field to feed them, and could not settle a quarrel without it ending in blood. They lived close to the ground, and they took what they could, and they understood almost nothing of the wide sky turning over their heads. And then the old Babylonian said, the sea gave something unexpected. They said that one morning in the first grey light, a being came up out of the water. He had the body of a great fish, and beneath the fish there was the face of a man, and he came up onto the shore, and did not frighten the people and did not rule them. He sat down among them in the daylight, and he began, slowly and without anger, to teach. He gave them letters, so that a thing once said need not be lost. He showed them how to put seed in the ground, and lead the river water along channels to keep a field alive through a dry summer. He taught them to read the year in the stars, and to raise walls and temples, and to gather what they grew and share it, so the weak were not simply left to die. The old stories say there were 7 of these teachers, across the long ages before a great flood drowned the first world, and that the first of them went back down under the sea each evening and waited there in the dark water until the world had need of him again. And there is one thing about these teachers that the priest pressed into wet clay, and then kept close for 3,000 years, one quiet thing about where their knowledge truly came from, that they were careful never to say plainly to ordinary people. You will hear it before the end of this, when you are already most of the way into sleep. For now it is enough to know that it is there, moving under everything, the way a slow current moves under a sea that looks perfectly still. And I should tell you before we begin that this is not only a story about one people on one shore. The same strange morning is remembered all over the ancient world. Far to the west in Egypt, they said a god with the head of a long-beaked bird handed them writing. North of that, in the dry hills where the Bible was written, they remembered beings who came down from the sky and taught men the working of metal and the reading of the stars, and the oldest book that keeps that memory does not call them sages at all. Further east, in India, they told of a great fish that rose out of the water to save one good man from a flood, and of 7 shining sages who carried the oldest knowledge across the drowning of the world. And later, on the rocky coasts of Greece, they said a chained titan stole fire from the gods and carried it down to people freezing in the dark. Different lands, different names, peoples who could barely have imagined one another, and underneath all of it the same single event, told over and over, knowing, coming down to ordinary human beings who did not have it before. We're going to follow that one event around the whole of the old world tonight slowly, the way you would follow a single thread of light to the bottom of a dark pool until it leads you somewhere very close to home. Before you sink any further, let me ask one quiet favour, and then I will get out of your way for the night. If these slow walks back into the old world are what finally lets you sleep, you can follow along here, so the next one comes and finds you on some other restless night. And if you feel like it, leave 2 small things in the comments before you drift off. The name of the place you're listening from, and the time on your clock right now, wherever in the world you are. It costs you nothing, and it quietly helps these stories find other people lying awake in the dark at the same hour, in some other city, on some other side of the earth. Then you can let all of it go, and follow the story down into the deep. Let me take you back to that shore properly, because the people who first told this were not playing. To them it was the most serious thing in the world, the morning their whole life changed. The land was the flat country between two rivers that we now call Iraq, and the time was about 5,000 years ago, when the first true cities anywhere on earth were being raised out of mud brick in a land the people there called Sumer. Before the teaching came, the Babylonians said, the people of that country lived the way animals live, with no order running through their days. They had no writing, so nothing could be kept. They had no farming they could lean on, so a dry year was a death sentence. They had no law, so the strong simply took, and the weak simply lost. And they understood almost nothing of why the river rose, or where the dead went, or what the lights overhead were doing as they wheeled through the night. And then the being they called Oans came up out of the gulf. They said he had the form of a fish, and that under the fish there was something like a man, and a human face beneath the head of the fish, and feet like a man's beneath the tail. He did not come to be worshipped. He came, day after day, to sit in the open daylight and hand these people, patiently, one piece at a time, everything a frightened crowd needs in order to become something larger, which is a people. He gave them the marks that became writing. He gave them the seed and the channel and the turning of the year. He gave them the wall and the temple and the shared store of grain, and the first rules for how a man might live beside a stranger without one of them ending up dead. And here is the detail the old tellers always came back to, the one worth carrying down into sleep with you. When the sun went down each evening, Oans did not stay to be thanked, and he did not stay to be obeyed. He went back down into the dark water, and ate nothing the whole while he was among them, and waited there beneath the surface until the light came back, and the teaching could go on. The priests had a word for the 7 of them. They called them the Apkallu, which you can simply hold in your mind, if you like, as the shining ones who came before. And for hundreds of years afterward, the priests of those temples would dress in cloaks cut and sewn to hang, like the skin of a great fish, draped down the back and over the shoulders, so that when one of them stood by the altar in the lamplight, he carried the shape of Oans on his own body, and the first gift was remembered in the room. The diggers have even turned up little figures of these fish-cloaked sages, buried on purpose in small boxes under the floors of houses, set there to guard the people who slept above them. Think of that as you lie under your own roof tonight. 3,000 years ago, someone laid a small image of one of these water teachers beneath the floor of a bedroom, exactly so that the knowing would keep watch over the sleeper through the dark. You are not the first person to go down into sleep hoping that something old and kind is keeping the knowledge safe while you do. And the first of those 7 sages has a story all his own, the strangest in the whole long tale, and it is worth slowing right down for because it is secretly about you. His name was Adapa, and he was said to be the wisest man the world had yet held, a sage of the city of Eridu, the oldest city of all, the one the Sumerians believed was the very first place kingship and knowing ever came down to earth. The god of the deep, the lord of the sweet underground waters, had made Adapa wise above all other men. He had given him understanding and a clear mind, and the broad wisdom to see how the world was put together. He had given him everything except one single thing. He had not given him unending life. One day Adapa went out in his little boat onto the water to fish, the way he did to feed the temple, and a hard wind came up out of the south and capsized him and threw him down into the cold sea. And Adapa, in his anger and his fright, did a thing no ordinary man could have done. He spoke a word against the wind itself, and the word had such power in it that the south wind's wing was broken, and for 7 days the wind did not blow at all across the land. And up in the heavens the high God noticed the stillness, and asked why no wind had come, and was told that a man down below, a mortal man, had broken the very wing of the south wind with a word. And the high God was troubled, and sent down word that this Adapa must be brought up before him to answer for it. Now here is the heart of it, the part to carry down towards sleep. The god of the deep, who loved Adapa, knew the man was about to be offered the one thing he had been denied. He knew that when Adapa stood in the high court, frightened and small, they would set before him the bread of life and the water of life, the food that would have made a mortal man live forever. And the god of the deep, for reasons the old story leaves you to feel rather than explains, told Adapa not to take them. He told him that what they offered him up there would be the bread of death and the water of death, and that he must refuse it, must let it sit there untouched, no matter how kindly it was pressed on him. So Adapa went up, and he stood in the court of heaven, and he was afraid, and he did exactly as his God had told him. They brought him the bread of life, and he would not eat it. They brought him the water of life, and he would not drink. And the high God looked down at this wise man refusing the gift with both hands, and laughed, and asked him why. And when Adapa explained that he had been warned, the god told him the truth he had not let himself believe. That was the bread of life. That was the water of life. You were offered the thing every man since has wept for, and you pushed it away with your own hand. Sit with that a moment in the dark, because it is gentler than it sounds, and it sets the whole night in motion. The wisest man the world had made was handed immortality, and lost it, not because he was foolish, but because he reached for safety instead of trusting the thing right in front of him. He grasped after the warning, the caution, the closed and careful hand, when the open hand was the one that held the gift. The first of the 7 sages was the first to learn the law the rest of this story keeps circling. The thing you most want is usually right there, already being offered, and the only thing that keeps it from you is the grip of your own fear. Hold that loosely as you breathe out. The first sage almost held forever in his hands and let it go by clutching. You will hear that same quiet law come back tonight, again and again, in country after country, until it stops being a story about ancient men and starts being a story about the way you reach for the things you are afraid you cannot have. And the people of that land kept the memory of the 7 in their records with a strange and beautiful care. They wrote out long lists of their kings, scratched into clay, reaching back and back into the time before the flood. And the kings at the very top of those lists, the ones from before the water came, are given reigns no person could ever have lived. Tens of thousands of years each, one king ruling for 28,000 years, another for 36. You do not need to believe the numbers. The old scribes were not really counting years. They were telling you that these were the deep ancestors, the ones from the far side of the flood, when the world was closest to the gods, and the air still held the first teaching. And beside each of those impossibly old kings, the tradition set one of the sages, one of the Apkallu, as the one who stood at his shoulder and kept the knowing alive in the court. A king, and beside him a sage who remembered where the gifts had come from. The crown took care of the power, the sage took care of the deeper thing, the memory of the source, the quiet line back to the water. And when the flood finally came and swept the old world away, it was understood that the sages were the ones who made sure the knowing crossed over to the time of ordinary men, so that the people on the far shore would not have to begin again from nothing. Now you might fairly wonder how a story like this reached us at all, across 5,000 years and the fall of every kingdom that ever held it. And the answer turns out to be a single human being, a man almost as strange as the tale he saved. He is the first of the two real people I want you to meet in this. His name was Berossus, and he was a priest in the city of Babylon about 2,300 years ago, in the last years when that city still remembered what it had been. By his lifetime the old world was already going out, the way a lamp goes out. A Greek army under Alexander had swept through and taken everything, and Greek-speaking kings now sat where the kings of Babylon had sat, and the long temple learning of that country, the watching of the stars and the reading of the clay and the story of the fish sage who taught the first people, was slipping out of living hands and into silence. Berossus could see it going, and so he did a quiet, stubborn thing. He sat down and wrote the whole of it out, in Greek, in the very language of the men who had conquered him, so that the people who had taken his world might at least carry its memory forward. He wrote down the old kings, and the flood, and the 7 sages, and Oan's coming up out of the sea to teach. He gathered 3,000 years into a book, and he handed that book to the world that was burying his own. And then time did to his book what it does to almost everything. The work itself was lost. Not one complete copy of what Berossus wrote has ever been found. What we have of him are fragments, a handful of lines and paragraphs that other writers, centuries later, happened to copy into books of their own before his was gone for good, the way a few seeds live through a fire only because a bird had already carried them off somewhere else. The story of Oan reached you at all because one tired priest refused to let it sink, and because a few strangers after him paused long enough to copy a few lines before the rest went dark. Hold on to that for a moment while your breathing slows, because it quietly lays out the shape of everything still to come. The knowledge did not survive because it was locked away by the powerful. It survived because, here and there, one ordinary person stopped and paid attention and carried a small piece of it forward. It was never really the property of the temple that guarded it. It was only ever as safe as the next person willing to remember it. And the next person who truly mattered, more than 2,000 years after Berossus laid down his pen, would turn out to be a young man with ink-stained hands and no place at all in that learned world, who found the lost flood of the old kingdom by lamplight in a museum, and was so undone by what he had just read that he came up out of his chair, like a man breaking the surface of deep water. But we will come to him. We will leave them there for now, 3 lives strung 100 generations apart. The fish-robed teacher who rose from the sea asked for nothing and slipped back under the dark water every evening. The wisest of the sages, who held forever in his 2 hands for the length of a heartbeat and set it down. And the weary priest bent over the clay at the end of his world, copying it all out for the people who had taken everything from him, so that some thread of it would still be here, this quiet, to reach you. The man who brought all of this back up into the light was not a priest, and not a scholar, and not anyone the learned world of his day would have let through the front door. He was a working man, and his hands, when he first walked into the story, were stained not with ink but with engraver's acid. His name was George Smith, and he was born in London about 180 years ago, into a poor family with no money and no path to the kind of schooling that opened doors. At 14 he was put to a trade, apprenticed to a firm that engraved banknotes, and he turned out to be very good at it, because the work asked for a steady hand and an endless patience for tiny marks, and he had both. He should, by every sensible measure of his world, have spent his whole life bent over a metal plate, cutting the small clean lines that go onto money, and died unknown. But something had caught him young and would not let go. In his spare hours, the hours that were his own, he began to haunt the British Museum, where the diggers had been sending back crate after crate of broken clay from the buried cities of the country we were just standing in, the old land between the rivers. Most people walked past those cases the way you walk past a wall. George Smith stood in front of them, and he could not look away. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into that clay were a writing no living person had read for more than 2,000 years, a writing the scholars themselves were only just beginning to crack, and this engraver, with no Greek and no Latin and no standing at all, taught himself to read it. On his lunch breaks, standing up at the cases, year after year with no one paying him to do it, until he could read the dead language of Babylon better than almost anyone alive. And he could only do that because just a little while before, another driven man had risked his neck to win back the key to that writing in the first place, and his story is worth a moment of its own because it is the same shape again. For centuries the wedge-shaped script has been completely silent, a writing no one on earth could read. The thing that finally cracked it open was a vast inscription carved high on a cliff face in the mountains of Persia, the same words cut 3 times over in 3 different tongues, left there by an ancient king to boast of his deeds. If a person could copy it down and work one language against another, the dead script might be forced to speak again. But the carving was set deliberately out of reach, 100 feet up a sheer rock wall, where no later hand could deface it. So a British officer named Henry Rawlinson went up after it. For years he climbed that cliff, balancing on narrow ledges, hanging from ropes and ladders over a long drop onto the rocks below, copying the marks one painstaking line at a time, returning season after season, and reaching the most impossible part of the inscription. The old stories say, only with the help of a local boy light and fearless enough to scale the bare rock where Rawlinson himself could not go. A man dangling over a precipice in the mountains, copying down a king's forgotten boast, so that a forgotten writing could live again. That is what it cost just to recover the ability to read, and only because he paid it could a poor engraver in London, a few years later, stand at a museum case and quietly learn the alphabet of the dead. The museum could not keep ignoring a thing like that, and eventually they took him on quietly to help sort and piece together the mountain of broken tablets. And it was there, one day in the year 1872, bent over a fragment of clay that had been baked hard in a fire that fell on a palace 2,500 years before, that George Smith read a line no modern eye had ever read. It was part of a long poem, and in the part in his hands a man was being told to tear down his house and build a great boat, and to carry into it his family and the seed of every living thing, because the gods were going to send a flood to drown the world. He was reading the story of the flood, not the one most of his countrymen already knew from a single old book, but an older telling of it, far older, pressed into Babylonian clay long before. The thing the priests had carried and Berossus had written down and the centuries had buried was sitting in his hands in the original, and he was the first person in more than 2,000 years to understand a word of it. and it is worth slowing down over what that buried story actually said, because it folds straight back into everything else tonight. In the Babylonian telling, the gods grow weary of the human race. The cities have filled up and grown loud, and the noise of all that crowded living rises up and keeps the gods from their rest. And so they decide, in their irritation, to wipe the people out with a flood. But one of the gods will not go along with it quietly. And of all the gods it could have been, it is the same one who lay behind the teaching from the start, the lord of the sweet waters of the deep, the god the Sumerians called Enki, who had sent the fish-robed sages up out of the gulf in the first place, and who had made Adapa wise. He has sworn an oath not to warn any human directly, so he finds a way around it. He goes to the reed wall of one good man's house, and he speaks not to the man but to the wall, in a whisper, knowing the man is on the other side listening. "Tear down your house," he says to the wall, "and build a boat. Let go of your possessions and save your life. Take aboard your family and the craftsman and the seed of every living thing." And the man does it. He builds the great boat and seals it with pitch, and brings aboard his people and the animals, and the flood comes down so terribly that the gods themselves are frightened by what they have set loose. And the old poem says they cowered against the dome of heaven like dogs, pressed together and shaking, watching the world they had drowned. For days the water covers everything, and then the boat comes to rest on the top of a mountain, and the man opens a hatch, and he begins to send out birds to learn whether the water has gone down. He sends a dove, and the dove finds no place to land and comes back to him. He sends a swallow, and it too returns, and then he sends a raven, and the raven does not come back because the raven has found the drying ground, and by that one bird that does not return he knows the world has come back up out of the water. Then he makes an offering on the mountain, and the hungry, chastened gods gather round the rising smoke of it. The old line says, "like flies." You may know a version of that story already from elsewhere, and that is exactly the point George Smith understood the instant he read it. He was holding an older telling of a flood the whole world remembered in pieces set down in Babylon long before. A dove sent out, and a raven, and a boat at rest on a mountain, and one family carrying the seed of all life across the water. He had grown up, like everyone around him, with the account of Noah from the opening pages of the Bible, and here, in his hands, was plainly the same flood, older, in an alphabet no churchman had ever read. The deep water that drowned the world was also the thing that carried the knowing across it, sealed in a boat, the same way the deep had carried the teaching up to the shore in the beginning. The God of the deep gives the knowledge, and the God of the deep preserves it through the ruin, whispering through a wall so that one listening person can carry the seed of everything to the far side. And here the careful, patient engraver did something that tells you everything about what that moment was. The men who were there said that George Smith, reading it, jumped up from the table. He began to move about the room in a state they could only call wild, and in the grip of it he started to pull at his own clothes, as though the body simply could not hold what had just come up in him, and had to do something, anything, to let it out. A quiet man, a man whose whole training was stillness and control, undone in an instant by a few lines of the oldest writing on earth. He had not invented anything. He had not earned it with rank or fortune. He had simply paid attention long enough, and the thing rose up out of the deep where it had been waiting and broke the surface in him. And what happened next, out in the wider world, is part of why this story matters so much right now. So let it carry you a little further before you sink. Smith stood up not long after and told a room full of London's most serious men what he had found, that the flood of the Bible had an older parent buried in Babylonian clay. And the room did not stay calm. The news ran out through the whole country like a current. Newspapers carried it. People who had never thought twice about a clay tablet argued about it over dinner. The most powerful man in the land, the Prime Minister himself, is said to have come to hear the engraver speak, and to have stayed late into the night. Because the thing Smith had pulled up out of the deep touched the one book almost every household in that country lived by, and it asked a question that would not sit still. If the flood was written down in Babylon before it was written in the Bible, then where did the story truly begin, and what older, deeper source had every later people been drinking from without knowing it? It frightened some of them, and it thrilled others, and what almost none of them could see, in the heat of the argument, was the quiet thing underneath. They were watching the very event of the old stories happen again in their own century. A piece of the oldest knowing, lost under a flood of time, surfacing in the hands of one overlooked man, and the whole world above arguing about who it belonged to, while the water that carried it went on running, calm and deep, under all of them. There is one more piece of his story, and it is almost too neat to be true, except that it is. The tablet in his hands was broken. The most important part of the flood story was missing, snapped off, and lost somewhere in the ruin of a city on the far side of the world. And a London newspaper, hearing of the discovery, did a strange and generous thing. They offered to pay for Smith himself to travel out to the buried city and look for the missing piece. So the engraver, who had never left England, was put on a boat, and then on horseback, and carried across Europe and into the old land between the rivers, to the very mound under which the broken palace lay. And there, sifting through the rubble of a place that had burned and fallen 25 centuries before, in a field of countless thousands of shattered fragments, he found it. He found the missing piece of the very tablet he'd been reading in London. The odds against that are past counting, and yet it happened, as though the story, once a person was finally willing to come looking, was willing to be found. And there is a last secret folded into that flood poem, one that ties straight back to the wise man who refused the bread of life, and you should hear it as you go down. The man who built the boat and rode out the flood, the Babylonian Noah, was given a thing at the end that almost no human in any of these stories is ever given. The gods, sorry for what they had done, and grateful that the seed of life had been saved, took the flood survivor and his wife and set them apart, and granted them the one gift Adapa had pushed away with his own hand. They gave them unending life. They carried him off to live forever at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world. And the name the story gives that man, in the old tongue, means something close to he who found life. Lay those two sages side by side as you breathe out. One was the wisest man alive, and he was offered forever, and he clutched at caution and lost it. The other was only a good man who listened to a whisper through a wall, who let go of everything he owned and trusted the thing right in front of him, and he was the one who found the life that does not end. The difference between them was not cleverness, it was the open hand. We will keep meeting that exact difference, in country after country, all the way down into sleep. He died young, George Smith, out in that country a few years later, worn down by the hard travel and a fever, only 36 years old. But by then the thing was done. The flood of the old kingdom and the world that held it, the 7 sages and the fish-robed teacher and the long memory Berossus had tried to save was back in the light for good, dug up out of the deep by a poor man with steady hands who had simply refused to look away. So let your own hands lie still on the bed a moment and feel how little this asks of you. The knowledge did not go to the man with the most schooling, or the most money, or the highest birth. It went to the one who kept turning toward it. That is the whole of what those two men, the priest and the engraver, 2,000 years apart, have in common. Neither of them made the knowledge. Each of them only refused to let it sink, and so it surfaced in them, and the question that has been sitting quietly under everything so far, the one we go to next, is why? Why does it work like that? Why does the knowing come up out of the deep and not down from above, and why does it surface most easily in the very people the world overlooks? Here we come to the heart of it, the part the priests pressed into the clay and guarded the longest, and it is gentler and stranger than all the empires and floods around it. To reach it, I want you to think for a moment about water, since the teachers in this story came up out of it, and since you're lying here at the close of the day letting your own self go quiet, which turns out to be the very same thing. Picture a pool, deep and clear, with a sandy bottom you could see straight down to if the water were still. Now picture someone wading into it, splashing, stirring it up. The moment the surface starts churning, the bottom vanishes. The water clouds, the light scatters, and you could swear looking down that there is nothing there at all, only murk and movement. But nothing has actually left the pool. The bottom is exactly where it always was. It is simply that the agitation on the surface has hidden it, and if the person climbs out and you wait, and the water slowly comes back to rest, the bottom returns to view on its own, every grain of sand right where it had been the whole time. You did not put it back. You only stopped stirring and let the water remember how to be still. Your mind is that pool, and the old teachers knew it long before anyone had a word for it. All day the surface of you is churning, with worry, with reaching, with 100 small frightened calculations of getting through a day. And in that churning, the deep part of you, the part that already holds far more than you think it does, simply cannot be seen. You feel, on a hard day, as though there is nothing down there, no steadiness, no knowing, no quiet wealth of self, only the murk on top. But nothing has left you. The depth is exactly where it always was. It is only hidden under the stirring. This is why the teaching could never be forced, and why grabbing for it pushes it away. The grabbing is itself more stirring. The harder you churn the surface trying to see the bottom, the more the bottom disappears. It is the same mistake Adapa made in the court of heaven, reaching for the careful, frightened thing and missing the gift that was already set in front of him. And it is why the knowing comes up easiest in the people the world passes over. The wise man fishing alone in his little boat, the poor engraver on his lunch break, the tired priest at the end of everything, the good man who only had to listen at a reed wall. They were not cleverer than the powerful. They were quieter. The reaching crowd never let their own water settle long enough to see what was already in it. And the gentlest part of all is the one that should almost make you laugh where you lie, because it means the work waiting for you tonight asks nothing hard of you at all. You have done this 10,000 times over without once giving it a name. It happens every time you stop straining after a word you've lost and turn to something else, and feel it float up a moment later on its own. You do it every time a problem you fought all day quietly solves itself in the shower, or on a walk, or in the soft minutes before sleep, when the surface of you finally goes still. The answer was never being built in those moments. It was rising. It was always down there, and the only thing that had been keeping it from you was the churning of trying. The careful people who measure such things have watched this happen again and again in the most ordinary of rooms. They give people a hard problem, and the ones who grind at it without rest do worse than the ones who are allowed to step away, to sleep, to let the surface settle. The answer comes in the lull, not in the grip. The old world simply drew that lull as a sage rising up out of deep water, because that is exactly what it feels like from the inside, something you did not make surfacing the moment you stop thrashing. And of all the lulls a person ever has, the deepest and the most generous is the one you're sliding into right now. There is a soft country on the edge of sleep, the few minutes when the day has let go of you, but sleep has not quite closed over you yet, and it has been known forever as the place where the deep gives up its treasures. It is the threshold where people have always caught their best ideas, the answer they chased all day arriving uninvited just as the mind goes loose, the line of a song, the missing piece of a problem, the thing they could not see while they were straining for it. More than one great discovery in the history of our kind is said to have come exactly there, in a doze, in a dream, in the soft drift at the edge of the dark, handed up whole to a mind that had finally stopped reaching. The thinkers who lived by it learned to go down into that threshold on purpose, to sit at the lip of sleep with a quiet question, and simply wait, not grasping, while the still water did the work and floated the answer up. So understand what is actually happening to you as you lie here. You're not just falling asleep. You're lowering yourself, on purpose, into the exact place the whole of this story has been pointing at, the doorway the old teachers came up through, the still deep water where the knowing waits. You do not have to fish for anything tonight. You only have to keep going down. Whatever has been churning in you all day is settling grain by grain, and the depth of you, which never went anywhere, is coming quietly back into view in the dark. So the teaching the seven brought was never really a set of facts to be carried in from outside and stacked up in a person. The writing and the law and the turning of the stars, all of it was the surface trade of it. Underneath, the real gift was this single quiet instruction, the one the priests guarded longest. Stop stirring, and what you need will come up of its own accord. The teachers came from the still deep water because the still deep water is where the knowing has always lived, in the old shore cities and in you, and the way to it was never to reach harder. It was to grow quiet enough that the bottom of you came back into view, and feel, as I say it, what is already happening to you. Your breathing has slowed without your asking it to. The surface of your day is going still. The very thing the teaching points at is taking place in your body right now, in the dark, as the pool of you settles towards sleep, and the depths come quietly back into the light. Carry that picture of still water with you now, south and west, across the desert and down the long green ribbon of the Nile, into old Egypt, because the Egyptians told this same thing in their own way, and they put a warning inside it that the people of the rivers never quite did. They had a god they pictured with the head of a long-beaked bird, the ibis that walks the river banks, and they called him Thoth. And Thoth was the one, they said, who handed human beings writing. He was the scribe of the gods, the keeper of the records of the dead, the one who set down the measure of time and the turning of the moon, and the Egyptians believed that the marks a scribe made on papyrus were quite literally the words of the god, his gift, lent down into human hands. To learn to write in that country was to take up a thread that ran straight back to Thoth, the same way the marks of the first cities ran back to the teacher who came out of the sea. A different land, a different shape for the giver, and underneath it the very same event. Knowing, handed down to a people who did not have it before. But the Egyptians, or at least the wisest of them, noticed something the simple version of the story misses, and an old Greek who loved Egypt wrote it down so that it survived. He told it as a conversation between Thoth and one of the old kings of Egypt. Thoth comes to the king proud of his gift, and lays writing in front of him, and says that here at last is a thing that will make his people wiser and sharpen their memory. And the king looks at it for a long moment and tells him no. He tells the god that he has it backwards. This gift, the king says, will not strengthen memory. It will weaken it. Because once people can set a thing down outside themselves, in marks on a page, they will stop carrying it inside. They will trust the mark instead of the knowing. They will seem to know a great deal, while inside they grow emptier, mistaking the words on the clay for the thing the words were only ever pointing at. Let that land softly, because it is the hinge of this whole night. The first and greatest of the written gifts came with a warning attached from the very beginning, and the warning was this: the writing is not the knowing. The writing is a finger pointing at the moon, and a person can spend a whole life studying the finger. Everything the sages carried up out of the water, all of it, the letters and the laws and the star charts, was the outside of the gift, the part that could be set down and locked in a temple. The inside of the gift, the actual knowing, was never on the clay at all. It was the thing the clay was trying, and always a little failing, to remind you of. And you have felt the truth of that king's warning in your own life more often than you would like. You have read the right book and underlined the right lines, and been able to say all the correct words back, and still felt underneath that you did not truly know the thing at all, that you are holding the finger and not the moon. That gap between knowing the words and knowing the thing is the oldest problem in this story, and it is exactly the gap that closes when the surface of you goes quiet, and the real knowing rises from below to meet the words at last. And the Egyptians' teacher did not stay in Egypt. When Greek travellers came down into that old country and met Thoth, the scribe of the gods, they recognized in him their own messenger god, the swift one they called Hermes, and over the centuries the two melted together into a single towering figure of a teacher, a man-god they called thrice great, the greatest of kings, the greatest of priests, the greatest of those who know. They gathered under his name a body of writings about the hidden order of things, about the mind behind the world, and the way a person might come to see it, and they treated these writings as a thread reaching back to the very first knowing, the same thread that ran back through Thoth to the teacher in the water. And then those writings did what the knowing in this story always does. They were lost. For 1,000 years and more, the Latin world of Europe forgot them almost entirely, until one day, around 5.5 centuries ago, a single battered manuscript of them was carried into the city of Florence. And what happened next tells you exactly how much weight people have always quietly given this old current of knowing. The ruler of that city, an old and powerful man named Cosimo, the head of the Medici family, was near the end of his life, and he had a brilliant scholar in his household who was in the middle of translating the works of Plato, the great philosopher, out of the original Greek, the most prized recovery of the age. And Cosimo told him to stop. He told him to set Plato aside and to translate this older, stranger thing first, because the old man wanted to read the rumoured wisdom of the thrice great teacher before he died, and could not bear to go to his death with Plato finished and this left unread. So the recovery of Plato himself, the cornerstone of the whole rebirth of learning, was made to wait its turn behind a faded manuscript of the teaching that traced back to Thoth. Sit with how strange and how telling that is. Across thousands of years and the whole width of the known world, person after person kept deciding that this one quiet current of knowing mattered more than almost anything else they could lay their hands on, kept digging it back up out of whatever flood had buried it, kept ranking it first. And the thing they were so desperate to read said, at its heart, the gentlest and least complicated thing. It said that the divine mind they were searching the heavens for was not far off and not hidden in a temple at all. It was already within them, nearer than their own breath, and the whole work was simply to grow quiet enough to know what was already there. The most chased-after secret in the history of the world turned out to be a set of directions pointing the seeker back inside himself. So let your jaw unclench a little, and let the back of your tongue go soft, and let the words of this story be only a finger, pointing you gently back down toward the thing in you that was never written anywhere and never had to be. Now follow it north, out of Egypt, into the dry hill country, where another people were writing their own memory of the teachers, and where the story takes on a darker and stranger coat. Because there is a very old book, old enough that it was nearly lost like the work of Berossus, that tells of beings who came down from the sky to teach humankind, and it does not call them sages, and it does not entirely call them a blessing. It is called the Book of Enoch, after the man it is built around. For a long time most of the world thought it gone, until it was found, kept whole, in the mountains of Ethiopia, by a small and faraway church that had quietly held on to it for more than 1,000 years after everyone else let it slip. There it is again, the same shape as Berossus and the engraver. A piece of the oldest knowing, nearly lost, carried through the centuries by the people the larger world was not even watching. And what the Book of Enoch remembers is this. In the days before a great flood, the same flood that drowned the world of the 7 sages, beings the book calls the Watchers, came down from the heavens to the earth, and like Oans, and like Thoth, they taught. They showed human beings how to work metal out of the ground, and how to make weapons and tools from it. They taught the cutting of roots and the use of plants, and the reading of the stars and the signs of the sky, and the working of charms, and even, the old book says, how a face is painted and adorned. The very same event once more, knowledge brought down from above and placed in human hands. But here the storytellers were uneasy about it. They told it as something closer to a theft than a gift, a knowing that came down before its people were ready for it, and they said it taught humanity as much grief as it taught them craft. You can feel why they were uneasy, because you live among the far end of exactly that gift. We were handed the working of metal and the splitting of the smallest things, and we made wonders with it, and we made the bomb with it, the way the old book quietly feared. The Watcher's story is the human race looking at its own cleverness and feeling, underneath the pride, a flicker of fear that the knowing arrived faster than the wisdom to hold it. The book even names the one it blames most, a leader among them it calls Azazel, who taught men to beat metal into swords and knives and shields, the first tools made for killing, and taught women the secrets of bright stones and the painting of the face. And the book says 200 of these watchers came down together onto the peak of a mountain and bound themselves there with a shared oath before they descended, each one swearing the others to it, so that no single one of them could ever be blamed alone for what they were about to do. And here is where this people did something the others did not, and it is the reason their version still has such a strange grip on us. They remembered the children. They told that the Watchers took human wives, and that out of that mixing came a race of giants, beings too large and too hungry for the world to feed, and the old book gives them a name that has echoed down the whole length of time since. It called them the Nephilim, which carries in it the sense of the fallen ones, or those who came down, a race born of the meeting of the sky and the earth, of the teachers and the taught, and grown into something the world could not hold. It is a dark and gorgeous story. The human race, remembering the day it was handed powers it had not grown up enough to carry, and feeling the trouble that came in with the gift. Now here is the quiet thing I want to lay in your hands as you lie there, because it is the reason we came all this way north, and it is gentler than the giants and the swords. That same memory of the sky beings who came down and mixed with humankind and fathered the giants is not only in the lost book the far-off church kept, it is sitting, in a few cryptic lines, in the opening pages of the most printed book in the history of the world. Right before the story of Noah and his flood, the Bible itself pauses and says, almost under its breath, that in those days the sons of God came down to the daughters of men and took them as wives, and that there were giants in the earth in those days, the mighty men of old, the men of renown. 4 verses, and then it moves on, as though it had said something it half wished it had not. The fuller story, the names, the oath on the mountain, the teaching of metal and stars, all of that the Bible leaves out, or had cut away. But the seam is still there. The same beings the Sumerians remembered as shining ones who rose from the water, the same beings the Book of Enoch called the Watchers, are remembered in Genesis too, only under quieter names, the sons of God and the giants, the men of renown. It is the one event again, carried by yet another people, who kept the memory but lowered their voice when they told it. And the man the Bible sets at the very centre of that drowned world is one more in our quiet line, and the most striking of all of them. His name was Enoch, and the Bible gives him almost nothing, just a single sentence that has puzzled people for thousands of years. It lists him in the long line of the fathers before the flood, and where every other name in that list ends the same way, and he lived so many years, and he died. Enoch's line does not. Of Enoch it says only that he walked with God, and that he was not, for God took him. He did not die like the others. He was simply taken, lifted up out of the world while still living, the way the wisest of the Sumerian sages was carried off to live forever at the mouth of the rivers. And the lost book that bears his name fills in what the Bible left as a single sentence. It says that Enoch, a man and not a watcher, walked so closely with what was holy that he was taken up into the heavens alive, shown the whole order of the cosmos, the courses of the stars, and the chambers where the winds are kept, and brought back, and set it all down in writing for the rest of us. Another scribe, another ordinary human who went up into the height, which in these stories is the same direction as down into the deep, and carried something back so that the rest of us would not lose it. There is one more thing the book has Enoch do, and it is the tenderest turn in the whole dark tale, so let it reach you as your breathing slows. When the watchers saw the ruin their gift had brought, and felt the judgment closing over them, they were afraid, and they could not face the holy themselves, and so they came to the one human being who walked close enough to carry a message up. They came to Enoch, and they begged him to write out their plea for mercy and carry it into the heavens on their behalf. And Enoch did it. The man carried the prayer of the fallen teachers up before the throne, and waited, and brought back the answer. And the answer was no. There would be no mercy of the kind they hoped for, but fix your attention on the shape of it, not the verdict. The beings who came down from the sky with too much knowing, when the weight of it finally broke over them, turned for help to an ordinary man because he was the one who could still make the crossing between the deep and the height. The frightening knowledge came down from the watchers, but the carrying of it, the pleading and the writing and the keeping was done, every time, by a person no different from you. And then this book, like the teaching of the thrice great one, like the work of Berossus, was very nearly lost to the wider world entirely. For more than 1,000 years the West had only rumours of it, a forbidden book everyone had heard of and almost no one had read, named in a few old letters and then gone. Until, about 250 years ago, a Scottish traveller went looking for the source of the Nile and came back from the mountains of Ethiopia carrying something he had not gone looking for at all, complete copies of the Book of Enoch, kept safe in that faraway church the whole time the rest of the world had let it go. A while later, a scholar in England finally rendered it back into a language Europe could read, and the lost book of the Watchers and their forbidden teaching surfaced once more into the light, exactly the way the flood tablet would surface in George Smith's hands a few decades after that, exactly the way the wisdom of Thoth surfaced in a manuscript carried into Florence. The same event, again and again. A piece of the oldest knowing goes down under the centuries and is held in the dark by some overlooked and patient people, and then rises when the time comes in the hands of one person who went looking. So whatever you were handed too early, and whatever you were taught before you were ready, let it set down its weight for a moment. You're not the giant, too large and too hungry for the world. You are the other one, the man who walked quietly and could still make the crossing, the one who can carry the knowing through and lay it down gently and hold it without being burned. Let your shoulders sink back into the bed as that settles, the fear and the gift both, side by side, and neither one the whole story. Now go further east and we have gone all night, across the mountains into the old world of India, because the same story is waiting there too, and it is the one that should lift the hair on your arms a little, even as you sink, because there is no way these two peoples could have copied one another, and yet here is the fish again, and here, once more, are 7 sages carrying the knowing across a flood. They told of the first man, the father of all the people who came after, and they called him Manu. And one morning Manu was at the river, doing the most ordinary thing a person can do, cupping water in his hands to wash, when a tiny fish swam into his palms as did not swim away. And the little fish spoke to him. It begged him to keep it safe, to not pour it back into the river where the big fish would eat the small ones, and it promised that if Manu would protect it now, it would one day save him in return. So Manu, moved by the small, helpless thing in his hands, kept it. He put it in a jar, but the fish grew, and soon the jar was too small, so he moved it to a pond, and it grew again until the pond could not hold it, and he carried it to a great river, and then the river was not enough, and at last he carried the fish, now grown vast, down to the sea and let it go. And as it slid into the deep water, The enormous fish turned back to him and told him the thing it had been growing all that time to be able to tell him. "A flood is coming," it said. "A flood that will wash away everything that lives. Build a boat and wait for me, and when the water rises, come aboard." You feel the shape of it already lying there, because you have heard it twice tonight in other tongues. The god of the sweet deep water, whispering through a reed wall to a good man, "Build a boat," the being who rose from the gulf to teach. And now, on the far side of the world, a fish from the water again, warning one good man to build a boat and carry life across the drowning of everything. The same event. The same deep water that destroys the world and saves the knowing in the same motion. And Manu did as he was told. He built the boat. And when the flood came, and the water climbed and climbed until there was no land anywhere, the great fish came back, and this time the old tellers gave it a single horn rising from its head, and Manu tied a long rope to that horn and made the boat fast to it, and the fish towed him. It pulled the little boat full of the seed of life through a drowned and endless ocean, through the whole long ruin of the flood, swimming steadily north, until at last the horn of the mountains rose up out of the falling water, and the fish brought the boat to rest against the highest northern peak, and told Manu to tie the boat there and wait, and let the waters go down. And so the line of all later people came across the flood behind a fish, the same way the knowing came up to the first city behind a fish, in a country that had never heard the first story at all. But here is the part that ties the whole night into a single knot, the part I most want to leave glowing in the dark behind your eyes. Manu was not alone in that boat. In the old telling, riding with him across the drowned world, were 7 sages. The Indians called them the rishis, the seers, the ones who first heard the oldest sacred songs of that land not by inventing them, but by listening, by going so still and so deep that the eternal word simply rose up into them out of the silence, exactly the way the answer rises into you in the soft minutes before sleep. 7 seers, the same number that came up out of the gulf to the first cities between the rivers. And these 7 rowed the fish-drawn boat through the flood with the first man, and they carried in their keeping the whole of the sacred knowing of their world, so that when the water fell and the boat came to rest on the mountain, the songs and the wisdom would not have to be invented again from nothing. 7 sages carrying the knowing across the flood in a boat pulled by a fish from the deep. Set that beside the 7 Apkallu of Sumer, who also carried the knowing across their flood, and feel how far past chance it has gone. 2 peoples, a world apart, who could not have whispered a word to each other, both remembering the rescue of all wisdom as the work of 7 sages and a teacher from the water. And the Indians did one last thing with their 7 that the people of the rivers would have understood completely, and it is waiting for you on the next clear night you happen to look up. They set the 7 sages in the sky, the 7 bright stars that wheel together around the northern pole, the 7 that almost every people on earth has stared at and named, the ones you might know as the Great Bear or the Plough, or the 7 sisters' brighter cousins. Those 7 stars were, to the old Indians, the 7 rishis themselves, lifted up out of the flood and fixed in the heavens, turning slowly over the world every single night, so that no one would ever quite be able to forget that the knowing had been carried across the dark water by 7 who listened. The teachers came up out of the deep, and then they were set in the deep of the sky, and they are still up there, over your roof tonight, turning while you sleep. You have looked at them 100 times without knowing you were looking at the oldest memory our kind has. The memory of the night the wisdom of the world was saved by going still enough to hear it, and carried across the flood by 7, behind a fish, to the far shore where you're lying now. So let that settle over you like a sky. You do not have to hold the names, you only have to feel the size of it, that on every side of the ancient world, in tongues that never touched, people remembered the same thing, that what saves the knowing is never force and never grasping, but a fish from the still deep, and a few who listen, and one good soul willing to build the boat and trust the water. Let your breath go long and slow now, the way the great fish swam, steady and unhurried and sure of the way, towing everything that matters gently toward the shore. And now west again, all the long way back from the eastern mountains to the rocky coasts and islands of old Greece, for the last of the tellings, because the Greeks turned the one event into a single bright image you already carry in your own body. They told it as fire. In their oldest stories there was a being from before the age of men, one of an elder kind, and his name carried in it the word for forethought, for seeing what is coming. They called him Prometheus. And in the beginning the story says the high gods kept fire for themselves, up on the mountain, and meant to keep the human beings below in the cold and the dark, small and shivering and dependent. They did not want the people to have the flame, because fire was not only warmth. Fire was the beginning of every craft. With fire you could cook, and harden clay, and work metal, and hold back the night, and gather round something bright, and make a circle that could become a town. To give people fire was to give them the whole long road up out of the animal dark. And the gods, jealous of their height, said no. So Prometheus stole it. He went up to where the fire was, and he carried a single ember down, hidden, the old poet said, inside the dry pith of a tall stalk, a thin glowing coal cupped against the wind the whole way down the mountain. And he placed it in human hands. And from that one stolen ember every other fire on earth was lit, and the people began their long climb, and nothing was ever the same. The gods punished him for it without mercy. They chained him to a far rock at the edge of the world, and the story they told of his suffering is famous and grim. An eagle coming each day to tear at him, the wound closing each night so that the dawn could open it again. Lay that beside the watchers, chained and judged for the same crime of handing knowing down too freely, and you can feel how deeply our kind has always feared that the gift of fire comes with a price. But fix your attention, as you lie there, on the ember itself, not the punishment, because the ember holds the secret the whole night has been circling. Think about what fire actually does when it is given away. You can take a single candle already lit, and from it light a second candle, and a third, and 100th, and 1,000th, and carry the flame across a whole dark country, lighting every wick you pass, and the first candle does not shrink. It does not lose a thing. It burns exactly as bright after lighting 1,000 others as it did when it stood alone. Fire is the one kind of wealth that is not divided by being shared. It is only multiplied. And that is the deepest answer to the question that has run under all of this. The question of why the grasping powers always failed to keep the knowing for themselves. They guarded it like gold, like a thing that would be less theirs if anyone else had it. But it was never gold. It was fire. The knowing that came down from the sages was a flame, and a flame hoarded behind temple walls does not grow. It only gutters in the dark, unseen, while the world stays cold. The fire was always meant to be passed from hand to hand. That is the only way it has ever stayed alive at all. Hold your own hand open a moment in the dark and feel how natural it is, how a closed fist can hold a coin but never a flame, and how the only way to keep fire is to keep giving it away. And there is one last thing the Greeks left us, and it closes the whole circle so quietly that you could almost miss it. Because the Greeks too ended up with 7 sages, not fish-robed teachers from the sea, and not seers carried through a flood, but 7 famous wise men, real ones this time, ordinary men who lived a little over 2,500 years ago, and were remembered ever after as the wisest their world had made. Men like Thales, who first tried to explain the world without reaching for the gods, and who is said to have looked so deeply into the turning of the heavens that he foretold the very day the sun would go dark in an eclipse, and was proven right while 2 armies stood trembling on a battlefield. And men like Solon, who gave the city of Athens its first fair laws, and then sailed away for 10 years so that no one could pressure him to change them. The old lists do not always agree on exactly which 7, and they argued about it even then, but the number held, the same number that came up out of the water in the land between the rivers, the same number that rowed the fish-drawn boat through the flood in India, and was set among the stars. Across the whole width of that ancient world, peoples who could barely have imagined each other kept landing on 7 sages at the root of their wisdom. And here is what those Greek 7 were remembered for: not empires, and not fire, but a handful of very short sayings, the kind of line you could carry your whole life in a single breath. And there is one story about the wisest of them that holds the whole of tonight in a single scene, so let it play out slowly behind your eyes as you sink. Solon, the lawgiver, in his years of wandering, came at last to the court of a king named Croesus, who ruled a country so rich that his name became the very word for wealth, a man who owned more gold than anyone alive. And Croesus, proud of all of it, had his servants show Solon through the treasure houses, room after room of heaped gold and jewels, and then he turned to the wise man, certain of the answer, and asked him who was the happiest man he'd ever seen in all his travels. He expected Solon to say it was Croesus himself, of course, the richest king in the world. But Solon named a poor man instead, an ordinary Athenian named Tellus, who had lived a decent life, seen good children and grandchildren grow up around him, and died well, in honour, with enough. The king, stung, asked again, sure he must at least come second. And Solon named 2 more unremarkable people, brothers who had died quietly after one good day. And then he told the king the thing the king could not hear. Count no man happy, he said, until you have seen the end of his life. Wealth is no protection. The gods give a glimpse of blessedness to many, and then overturn them utterly. You have a great heap of gold, but I cannot call you happy until I know how your story ends. Croesus thought him a fool and sent him away. And then, the old historian tells us, the king lost his beloved son to a freak accident, and went to war drunk on his own certainty after misreading the oracle, and lost his whole kingdom, his gold, everything, and ended on a pyre about to be burned alive by the king who had beaten him. And it was there, with the flames being lit, that Croesus is said to have cried out Solon's name 3 times, finally understanding far too late what the wise man had tried to give him for free in the treasure room, that the grasping after more, the heaping up, the certainty that the gold made him safe, was the very thing that had blinded him. He had owned everything a person could own, and he had not owned the one thing that mattered, which was the quiet self-knowledge to see what he actually had while he had it. You feel why that story sat at the centre of Greek wisdom, because you have your own treasure rooms, smaller ones, and you have stood in them just as sure. So let the Greeks hand you their last and greatest gift, the line the whole old world treasured above the rest. The most sacred place the Greeks had was a temple at Delphi, high up in the mountains, where people came from every corner of the known world to ask the oracle there what their futures held. They would travel for weeks, with their gold and their desperate questions about love and war and money and death, the same questions Croesus carried, and as they climbed the last steps toward the place where the god was said to speak, they passed an inscription cut into the stone of the temple itself. 2 words, know yourself. Let the size of that settle over you in the dark. Before you ask the god anything, it said, before you reach for the future, before you grasp after the answer, you came all this way to seize, know yourself, turn the looking around. The thing you're climbing a mountain to find is already standing where you're standing, and the whole journey only ends when you stop reaching outward long enough to see it. The 7 who came up out of the deep in the beginning, and the 7 wise men of Greece at the far end of it, were saying, across all those miles and years, the exact same thing the thrice great teacher said in Egypt, and the still water says in you. The knowing you are hunting for out there has been in here the entire time. Go in, be still, and remember. So let the warmth of that reach you under the blankets, the simple kindness at the heart of it. Nothing real is taken from you when you carry it to someone else. Nothing real is found by grasping harder. Let your hands rest open and loose on the bed, the way hands hold nothing and are ready to give, and feel how much lighter that is than the closed and clutching fist of the king counting his gold. Now turn north, into the cold pine countries of the Old Norse, because they understood one thing about this better than almost anyone, and they built their whole picture of wisdom around it. They knew that the deepest knowing is not seized, it is received, and the price of receiving it is to let go of the very grip you are used to holding the world with. Their highest god was Odin, and he was not a god of comfort. He was a god who wanted to know, who would pay any price to understand the hidden shape of things, and the Norse told 2 great stories about what that cost him. In the first, there was a well at the root of the world tree, a still dark pool of water, and in that water was all wisdom, and it was kept by an old being who let no one drink for free. Odin came to that well and asked to drink, and the keeper named the price, one of your eyes. And Odin, the king of the gods, reached up and put out his own eye and dropped it into the dark water, and only then was he allowed to drink. Ever after he saw the ordinary world with half the sight other beings had, and saw the hidden world better than any of them, because he'd given up half of his outward looking to gain the inward kind. Sit with that a moment as your own eyes grow heavy. The wisdom was in the still water, the same still water as everywhere else tonight, and the way to it was not to grab but to give something up, to surrender the grasping outward gaze. And the second story is stranger and goes deeper, and it is the one to carry down into sleep. Odin wanted the runes, which to the Norse were not just letters, but the very secret shapes the whole of fate was written in, the deep grammar under all things, and the runes could not be taken by force, and could not be bought, and could not be learned from any teacher, because there was no teacher above the highest God. They could only rise up on their own to one who had gone deep enough to receive them. So Odin made himself the offering. He hung himself on the great world tree, wounded by his own spear, given to himself, the old poem says, by himself to himself, and he hung there 9 long nights over the dark deep below, taking no bread and no drink, no one to comfort him, swinging in the cold wind. He did not climb, he did not fight, he did not reach, he simply hung and emptied and waited, going down and down past the surface of himself into the dark. And at the very end of the 9th night, when he had let go of everything, when there was nothing left in him grasping or straining or holding on, the runes rose. He looked down into the deep screaming, the poem says, and took them up, and fell back from the tree, and he had them. The deepest knowing in all the 9 worlds came to him in the one moment he'd completely stopped trying to seize it. You see it, lying there. It is the still water again, in the coldest and most honest dress it ever wore. The Norse did not pretend the knowing was easy or cheap. They knew that to receive it you have to let go of the part of you that clutches, and that this can feel like a kind of dying, like hanging in the dark with nothing to hold. But they also knew that the letting go is the whole of it. The runes did not come while Odin reached. They came when he was empty and still, and had finally surrendered the grip. And that is the gentle secret underneath the grim picture, the thing for you tonight. You do not have to climb the tree and wound yourself. You only have to do the small, soft version of what Odin did, which is exactly what your body is doing right now. Let go of the grip. Stop holding the day so tightly. Let yourself hang, weightless and unafraid, in the dark over the deep, taking nothing, reaching for nothing, and trust that what you need will rise on its own to meet you the moment you have truly let go. And now all the way east again, to old China, because they tell it too, and they tell it with a quietness that fits this hour, as a thing that was never brought down by a stranger at all, but read, patiently, out of the world by people who looked closely enough. At the very beginning of their long memory of teachers there stands a figure they called Fu Shi, the first of the great sage rulers, the one who came when the people still lived like animals and lifted them up into a human life. And what the Chinese say he did is the same gift as everywhere else. The founding gifts, the things that turn a frightened crowd into a people. He taught them to make nets, and to fish, and to hunt, so they would not starve. He taught them to keep animals, and the beginnings of how families and marriage might be ordered so that life could go on in peace. But the deepest thing they say he gave them was a way of reading the hidden order of the world. He looked up, the old story says, and studied the patterns of the heavens, the markings of the stars and the turning of the seasons, and he looked down and studied the patterns of the earth, the marks on the birds and the beasts, the shapes the land made. And out of all that long looking he drew a set of simple signs, broken lines and unbroken lines stacked in figures, that were meant to hold the underlying patterns of everything that changes. He did not invent them out of his own head. He read them out of the world by going still and attending to what was already there. The knowing was written across the whole of creation the entire time, and the sage was simply the one quiet enough to read it. And there is a second Chinese teacher worth a moment, because his story is almost a small poem about this whole night. They tell of one called Kangji, who was given the task of inventing writing, the marks that would let a thing once known be kept and not lost, the very same gift Oannes brought up out of the sea and Thoth laid into Egyptian hands. And the way Kangji is said to have done it was not by force of cleverness. He went out and he watched. He watched the tracks that birds leave in the wet sand by the river, the clean, distinct prints of their feet. and he saw that each kind of bird left its own shape, that you could know what had passed by the mark it left behind. And from the footprints of birds he drew the first characters, signs that could hold the trace of a thing the way the sand holds the trace of the bird. Writing itself, in this telling, was read out of the patterns of the world by a man who paid attention to the marks at the water's edge. The story even says that on the day the characters were born, the heavens rained down grain, and the spirits cried out in the night, because once human beings could write, a great power had come into their hands, the same uneasy power the watchers brought, knowing that could now be kept and passed, and could no longer be controlled by those above. So feel, as you lie here, how China gave the gentlest version of the law. The knowing was not stolen, and it was not even handed down by a stranger from the sky. It was lying across the whole face of the world, in the stars and the seasons and the tracks of birds in the mud, waiting, and all it ever took to receive it was a person still enough and patient enough to look. You are surrounded right now, even in the dark, by more pattern and more order than you could read in a lifetime. You do not have to reach for any of it tonight. You only have to soften and let your attention rest, the way the sage's attention rested on the marks in the sand, while the deep part of you reads what it has always known how to read. And now, across the whole width of an ocean, the old peoples between the rivers never knew was there, to the green highlands of old Mexico, because the same morning is remembered even here, in a world utterly cut off from all the others, and that should be the thing that finally settles it for you tonight, past any doubt, as you go down. They told of a teacher they called the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, and the shape of his story will be familiar to you now, because you have heard it on every shore we have visited. He came to a people who lived roughly, and he did not come to rule them or to be feared. He came to teach. He gave them the growing of maize, the grain their whole life would be built on, the way Oans gave the first cities their seed and their channels. He gave them the working of fine things, the cutting of stones, the craft of the hands. He gave them the measuring of the year and the reading of the stars, and a calendar so exact it still astonishes the people who study it. He gave them writing and the keeping of records, and he asked, the old stories say, for no blood. In a world that had grown used to offering blood to its gods, this teacher wanted only flowers and song, only the gentle things. The same event again, on a shore that had been alone for thousands of years. Knowing, brought to a people who did not have it, by a teacher who asked nothing for himself. And the end of his story is the part that ties him to the sage who slipped back under the sea each evening. The feathered serpent did not stay. The old tellings differ on why, on the shame or the trickery or the simple turning of an age that drove him out, but they agree on where he went. He went to the edge of the eastern sea, the great water, and he left across it, the way the first teacher went back down into the gulf, and he promised, as he went, that he would return. For centuries the people watched the eastern water for him, kept the memory of him, held a place for the teacher who would come back across the sea. The giver of the knowing went back to the water, and the people kept watch and waited and remembered. You have heard that exact note tonight on 4 other shores. Here it is once more on a 5th that could not possibly have borrowed it, which means it was never borrowed at all. It is simply how human beings everywhere in every tongue have remembered the day the knowing came, and the ache of the giver going back to the deep, and the long faithful watching for it to rise again. Let that breadth hold you like deep water now. Not one people, and not one book, and not one shore. All of them, every separate corner of our kind, walled off from all the others by oceans and ages and mountains, reaching back into its oldest memory and finding the same thing waiting there. A teacher from the water, a gift freely given, a going back into the deep, and a promise that it would come again. They cannot all have copied it. It is in us, under all the languages, the oldest thing we remember, and you are carrying it too, lying here in the dark, the whole inheritance of it, quiet in the deep of you. And before we let the whole long line of it come together, go back with me once more to where we began, to the very first shore between the rivers, because the people there left us one more image, and it is the most precise of all, and the gentlest place to rest before the end. They had a word for the things the sages brought. They did not only think of writing and farming and law as separate gifts, they thought of them together as a single great set of patterns that underlie a civilized life. Every art and craft and office and idea that lets human beings live as something more than animals. And they had a name for that whole bundle of patterns. We can simply hold it tonight as the decrees, the designs of all the arts of living. And here is the part to carry down. Those designs were not kept up in the high heaven with the distant sky gods. They were kept in the deep. They were held by the same god of the sweet underground waters who sent the fish sages up and warned the good man of the flood, kept safe in his house in the deep beneath the oldest city, the city built right over the place where the fresh water rises up out of the earth. All the patterns of a whole civilization, every art a people could ever need, held under the water, in the deep beneath the first city, waiting to be carried up into the light of ordinary human life. And the old story of how they came up to the people is the same shape one more time. It was not seized by an army or bought by a king. They were carried up out of the deep and given to a city. There's designs handed over one by one so that the people could have the arts of a full human life. The deep kept the patterns. The deep gave them up. And once they were up in the light, in the hands of the people, they could never be put back or locked away again, because a thing that is known by the people is loose in the world for good. So here is the picture to hold as you cross over into sleep. Under the oldest city, under the floor of the whole world, there is a deep of sweet still water, and in it are kept the designs of everything worth knowing, and they have only ever come up into the light through someone quiet enough and willing enough to carry them. And that deep is not far away, and it is not only under an ancient city in a country you will never see. It is under you. It is the still depth of you that this whole night has been pointing at, where your own designs are kept, the shape of the life that is actually yours, waiting under the churned surface of your days to be carried up the moment you go quiet enough to reach it. You're lying directly over the well. You always have been. And there is one more story from that very first shore between the rivers, the oldest long story our kind has ever written down, and it belongs here, near the end, because it is the story of a man who heard about the gift the good flood survivor had been given, the unending life, and decided he would go and seize it for himself. It was carved on the same kind of clay George Smith bent over in London. The flood he read that night was one chapter of it. This is the chapter on either side. The man was a king named Gilgamesh, the strongest and proudest king of the old world, 2 parts god and 1 part man, who ruled a great walled city and had everything a person could want and was still not at peace. And then the one friend he truly loved, the wild man Enkidu who had become his brother, sickened and died, and Gilgamesh for the first time looked his own death in the face and could not bear it. The fear of it broke something open in him. If Enkidu could die, then so could he, and all his strength and all his walls and all his glory would one day be nothing. So he set out, half mad with grief and terror, to find the one man who had ever escaped death, the flood survivor living forever at the mouth of the rivers, to wring from him the secret of unending life. It was a terrible journey. He crossed mountains where no man had walked, and passed through a tunnel of total darkness racing the sun, and came at last across the waters of death to the old immortal man and his wife at the edge of the world. And he demanded the secret, and the old man told him the truth, which was the hardest thing Gilgamesh had ever been asked to hear. There was no secret to seize. The immortality had been a one-time gift of the gods after the flood, not a thing a man could win by being strong, or by travelling far enough, or by wanting it badly enough. And then the old man set him a small test, almost gentle, to show him the size of what he was really asking. If you want to defeat death, he said, first defeat sleep. Just stay awake. Sit here and do not sleep for 6 days and 7 nights. That is all. And Gilgamesh, the mightiest man alive, sat down to do it, and almost the moment he sat still, sleep rolled over him like a fog, and he slept and slept and slept, and did not wake for nearly a week. The strongest king in the world couldn't stay awake for a single week. How was he ever going to conquer death? But here is the part to carry down into your own sleep, because it turns, the way these stories always turn, toward mercy. As Gilgamesh was leaving, broken and empty-handed, the old man's wife took pity on him, and the old man told him one last thing. There was a plant that grew at the bottom of the deep, a thorny plant down under the fresh water, and whoever ate of it would have their youth restored. Not unending life, but renewal, a second beginning. And notice where it was. It was in the deep. It was down under the still water, the same deep the sages rose from, the same deep that held all the designs of living. So Gilgamesh tied heavy stones to his feet, the way a diver does, and he sank down through the water into the deep, and he found the plant, and he took it, and he cut the stones loose and rose back up to the surface, holding the one thing that could renew him. He had it in his hands. He had done what no one else had done, and gone down into the deep and brought the gift back up. And then, on the long road home, hot and tired, he stopped to bathe in a cool pool of water, and he set the plant down on the bank. And a serpent, drawn by the scent, slid up out of the water and ate it, and shed its skin and slipped away renewed, and the plant was gone. Gilgamesh sat down by that pool and wept. He had held it. He had gone all the way down to the bottom of the deep and carried it back, and he had set it down for one careless moment and lost it. The same shape as the wise man who refused the bread of life in the court of heaven. The same shape as the king on his pyre crying out the lesson he learned too late. The gift was real, and it was in his hands, and the grasping, exhausted, never-resting reaching of him could not keep hold of it. But the story does not end in that grief, and this is why it is the right one to leave you with before the threads come together. Gilgamesh goes home. He comes back to his great walled city, the one he had left in his terror, and the very last lines of the oldest story in the world have him standing on the wall of his own city, looking out over it, telling the man beside him to look at how well it is built, look at the brickwork, look at the gardens and the temple and the people living their lives inside it. He had gone to the end of the world to seize forever and lost it twice, and what he came home to was this: the ordinary life that was already his, the walls already built, the work of his own hands and the people in it, and the quiet enough to finally see them. He could not keep the plant from the deep, but he could come home and stop reaching and look at what he already had with eyes that had finally stopped grasping, and that, the oldest story says, turned out to be the only immortality a man was ever going to get, and enough. So let that rest on you, heavy and kind, as you sink. You do not have to cross the waters of death tonight. You do not have to dive for the thorny plant or stay awake 7 nights or wring a secret out of anyone. The gift was never going to be seized that way by anyone, not even by the strongest king who ever lived. All you have to do is what Gilgamesh finally did at the very end, after all the reaching failed. Come home to the deep that is already yours, stop grasping, and rest. And here, near the end, the whole long line of it comes together, and the quiet justice in it can finally be said out loud. Look back down the length of this night slowly, the way you would look back down a long road you have walked. A teacher rising out of the sea to a people in the mud and going back under the water every evening. The wisest of those sages offered forever in the court of heaven, reaching for caution and letting it slip through his hands. A good man at a reed wall, listening to a whisper, building a boat, carrying the seed of all life across a drowned world, and being given the very life the wise man refused. A god with the head of a bird, laying writing into human hands, and warning that the writing was only the smallest part. Beings coming down out of the sky with knowledge too large and too early, and an ordinary man named Enoch carrying their plea up to heaven and the knowing back down to us. A fish in a riverbank palm growing vast, towing a boat full of 7 sages and the seed of everything through the flood, and the 7 set afterward in the turning stars. A god of the cold north, hanging 9 nights on a tree, emptied of all grasping, until the deepest secrets rose to him on their own. A first teacher in the east, reading the order of the world out of the tracks of birds in the sand. A feathered serpent on a far shore no one else knew existed, teaching, asking only for flowers, and leaving across the eastern sea with a promise to return. Different lands, different ages, peoples who never met and prayed to different names, all remembering the same single event in their bones, knowing, coming down to ordinary human beings. And in almost every telling, there were powers who tried to keep it for themselves, who sealed it behind walls and handed it down only to their own, and let everyone else believe they had no right to it and no claim on it at all. But notice what could never be done in any of these stories, no matter how high the walls went. It could not be kept. Every temple that locked the knowing away was eventually dust, and the knowing was still here. Every priesthood that guarded it died out, and a poor engraver on his lunch break, or a faraway church in the mountains no one was watching, or a quiet man who simply went still enough to listen, carried it through anyway. They built their walls and their secret orders around it as though it were a treasure in a vault. But it was never a treasure in a vault. It was a spring of water that runs in the deep under every house that was ever built. You can fence off the place where it happens to surface. You can charge admission to the well in your courtyard and tell the village it is yours. But you cannot own the water, because the same spring is already rising quietly under the floor of every home in the valley, including the smallest and the poorest, including the one you are lying in right now. That is the thing the priests were most careful never to say plainly. Not that the knowing was precious, which everyone could see, but that it could never actually be cornered, because it does not live in the temple. It lives in the deep of every person who was ever born, the rich and the forgotten alike, and the temple was only ever built over one place where it had been seen to come up. Remember the richest king in the world, crying out the wise man's name from the top of his pyre, finally understanding that all his heaped gold had bought him nothing of the one thing that mattered. And remember the poor engraver, with no gold at all, into whose steady hands the oldest story on earth quietly rose. The grasping king lost everything. The empty, attentive man received everything. There is no resentment owed for the long con of the walls and the temples, only a kind of quiet smile, because it was always going to fail. The water was under your floor the whole time. It is under your floor right now. So let me hand you, at the very last, the one short line the priest pressed into the clay and guarded for 3,000 years. The line that has been moving under every story tonight, now that you are soft and heavy and most of the way gone. It is only this. What the sages came to teach, you were always meant to remember. Not to learn, as if it were foreign and far off and belonged to other greater people. To remember, as if it were yours, and old, and only waiting under the surface for you to go quiet enough to let it rise. You do not have to do anything with that now. You're going to do something with it tomorrow, without trying, and it helps to know where. It will come at the moment you catch yourself reaching hard for the thing you are sure you do not have. The closed hand around the phone, the grip in the chest before you walk into the room, the churning the second you imagine the money, or the person, or the proof that you finally matter. That grip is the surface of the pool being stirred. It is Adapa reaching for the careful, frightened thing and missing the gift in front of him. It is the king counting his gold and seeing nothing. And tomorrow, in that exact moment, you will remember the still water, and you will do the one small thing every sage in every land was always pointing at. You will stop stirring. You will let your hand open, the way Odin let go on the tree, the way the good man let go of everything he owned and stepped into the boat. You will let your breath go long and let the surface come back to rest, and you will trust for 3 quiet seconds that what you need is already down there in the deep of you and rising to meet you. By morning, the old certainty will have closed back over you, of course, the sure feeling that nothing rose in the night, that the water is empty, that you're exactly who you always were, and the still pool was only a bedtime story. That is just the surface of you beginning to stir again with the noise of a new day. There is no quarrel to have with it. All that is left to do is come back here, the next night, and the one after that, and let the water settle again, until the settling stops being something you do, and becomes something you are, and the knowing comes up so easily you forget it was ever hard. That is why the sage went back under the sea each evening, not to leave, to go down into the deep where the knowing lives and rest there and rise again in the morning carrying a little more of it into the light. You're doing the very same thing tonight. You're not losing the day. You're going down into the deep to rest, the way the teacher did, so that you can rise in the morning carrying a little more. So go down now, the way he did. Let the day close over you like calm water closing over a swimmer who has stopped fighting the tide. Feel the weight of you sink, slow and unafraid, down past the churning of the surface, down past the reaching and the guarding and the long noise of the day, down to where it is dark and still and holds you completely. The 7 sages are turning in the stars over your roof. The spring is rising under your floor. The teacher is resting in the deep, and so are you. You do not have to come back up tonight. The knowing will keep. It has kept for 5,000 years, through floods and fallen kingdoms and every wall ever built around it, and it will still be here, rising gently under the floor of you when the light returns. For now there is only the deep and the dark water, and you sinking softly into sleep, remembering without a single word everything the teachers ever came to say. They had a class of wise men, priests of the old Persian faith, keepers of the sacred fire and watchers of the night sky, famous all across the ancient world for their learning, for reading the turning of the heavens and the meaning folded into it. And the name of these wise men, in their own tongue, came down into Greek, and then into every language of the West, and it is a word you say without ever thinking where it came from. They were called the Magi, and from the Magi, the star-reading wise men of the East, we get the word magic. The whole word for hidden knowing, for the secret art, is simply the name of a people who sat under the desert stars and read the order written across them, the same order the first sages came up out of the water to teach, the same patterns the Chinese sage read in the tracks of birds. When you say the word magic, you're saying, without knowing it, the name of the watchers of the eastern sky. And these star readers left one image so famous that it has travelled into the most told story of the Western world, and you will recognize it, because it is the same shape as everything tonight. The old tradition tells of Magi, wise men of the East, who were watching the night sky and saw a single star rise that they understood to mean that something long awaited had finally come into the world, and who left everything and followed that one star across the deserts to find it. Set aside whatever you make of the rest of that story and just hold the shape of it, because it is the oldest shape there is. The wise ones, the readers of the deep night, see a light rise and they follow it, not by force, not by storming heaven, but by quiet attention and a willingness to travel toward what they have read in the stillness. The same star watching that began in the first cities between the rivers, when the fish sage taught the people to read the year in the heavens, is still there at the far end, in the wise men following a light because they had grown quiet enough to notice it rise. And there was one teacher that high country remembered above the rest, a prophet of the early dawn of that faith who, the old stories say, received his understanding not by seizing it, but by being given it, drawn up into a vision of the order of things and the long war of light against the dark, and who came back down to teach his people to tend the fire, to speak the truth, and to wait for the light to win. Another one taken up, shown the order, and sent back to teach it. Another in the long, quiet line. The names change at every border. The event does not. Someone goes still enough, or is drawn up high enough, to see the pattern whole, and comes back down carrying a piece of it for the rest of us. And the piece is always, underneath, the same. The light is real. It is rising. Grow quiet, and follow it home. And now, before the whole of it draws together, come all the way back from every far country to the one small place you are actually lying in, the threshold of your own sleep, because everything we have followed across the whole ancient world has been pointing the entire time at the exact thing happening in your body in these next few minutes, and it is worth resting in that for a moment before the end. Think of where the knowing came up. In every single story, it came up out of the deep water. It came down in the doze and the dream and the vision. It rose to the god of the north only after 9 nights of hanging, emptied of all grasping. It was read by the sage only when he went still enough to see the tracks in the sand. It came to the wise men only because they were quiet enough under the dark to notice one light rise. Not one of these is a story about effort. Every one of them is a story about a particular kind of stillness, a particular willingness to stop reaching and let the deep give up what it holds. And there is exactly one doorway in an ordinary human life where that stillness arrives all on its own, without any discipline or any mountain or any sacred fire, and you're standing in it right now. It is the threshold of sleep. These few minutes you're in, where the day has loosened its grip but sleep has not yet closed over you, are the one time the surface of you goes quiet without your having to do anything at all. It is the doorway the old thinkers learned to wait in on purpose, lying down with a question and simply letting go, because they had noticed that the answer they had chased all day so often arrived right here, uninvited, the moment the chasing stopped. The line that would not come, the solution to the thing you had given up on, the shape of what to do, arriving whole and quiet just as you stopped trying to build it. This threshold has handed up more to our kind than all the straining libraries of the world, and it asks nothing of you but that you arrive and let go. You are arriving now. You do not have to use it tonight or fish in it for anything. You only have to recognize as you cross it that this soft drowning place at the edge of the dark is the very doorway the 7 came up through, the same still deep, opening quietly under you every single night of your life, free. And here, near the end, the whole long line of it comes together, and the quiet justice in it can finally be said out loud. Look back down the length of this night slowly, the way you would look back down a long road you have walked, a teacher rising out of the sea to a people in the mud and going back under the water every evening, the wisest of those sages offered forever in the court of heaven, reaching for caution and letting it slip through his hands, a good man at a reed wall, listening to a whisper, building a boat, carrying the seed of all life across a drowned world, and being given the very life the wise man refused, a god with the head of a bird laying writing into human hands and warning that the writing was only the smallest part, beings coming down out of the sky with knowledge too large and too early, and an ordinary man named Enoch carrying their plea up to heaven and the knowing back down to us. A fish in a riverbank palm growing vast, towing a boat full of 7 sages and the seed of everything through the flood, and the 7 set afterward in the turning stars. A god of the cold north, hanging 9 nights on a tree, emptied of all grasping, until the deepest secrets rose to him on their own. A first teacher in the east, reading the order of the world out of the tracks of birds in the sand. A feathered serpent on a far shore no one else knew existed, teaching, asking only for flowers, and leaving across the eastern sea with a promise to return. Different lands, different ages, peoples who never met and prayed to different names, all remembering the same single event in their bones, knowing, coming down to ordinary human beings, and in almost every telling, there were powers who tried to keep it for themselves, who sealed it behind walls and handed it down only to their own, and let everyone else believe they had no right to it and no claim on it at all. But notice what could never be done in any of these stories, no matter how high the walls went. It could not be kept. Every temple that locked the knowing away was eventually dust, and the knowing was still here. Every priesthood that guarded it died out, and a poor engraver on his lunch break, or a faraway church in the mountains no one was watching, or a quiet man who simply went still enough to listen, carried it through anyway. They built their walls and their secret orders around it as though it were a treasure in a vault. But it was never a treasure in a vault. It was a spring of water that runs in the deep under every house that was ever built. You can fence off the place where it happens to surface. You can charge admission to the well in your courtyard and tell the village it is yours. But you cannot own the water, because the same spring is already rising quietly under the floor of every home in the valley, including the smallest and the poorest, including the one you are lying in right now. That is the thing the priests were most careful never to say plainly. Not that the knowing was precious, which everyone could see, but that it could never actually be cornered, because it does not live in the temple. It lives in the deep of every person who was ever born, the rich and the forgotten alike, and the temple was only ever built over one place where it had been seen to come up. Remember the richest king in the world, crying out the wise man's name from the top of his pyre, finally understanding that all his heaped gold had bought him nothing of the one thing that mattered. And remember the poor engraver, with no gold at all, into whose steady hands the oldest story on earth quietly rose. The grasping king lost everything. The empty, attentive man received everything. There is no resentment owed for the long con of the walls and the temples, only a kind of quiet smile, because it was always going to fail. The water was under your floor the whole time. It is under your floor right now. So let me hand you at the very last the one short line the priest pressed into the clay and guarded for 3,000 years, the line that has been moving under every story tonight, now that you're soft and heavy and most of the way gone. It is only this. What the sages came to teach, you were always meant to remember, not to learn, as if it were foreign and far off and belonged to other, greater people. To remember as if it were yours, and old, and only waiting under the surface for you to go quiet enough to let it rise. You do not have to do anything with that now. You're going to do something with it tomorrow without trying, and it helps to know where. It will come at the moment you catch yourself reaching hard for the thing you are sure you do not have. The closed hand around the phone, the grip in the chest before you walk into the room, the churning the second you imagine the money, or the person, or the proof that you finally matter. That grip is the surface of the pool being stirred. It is Adapa reaching for the careful, frightened thing and missing the gift in front of him. It is the king counting his gold and seeing nothing. And tomorrow, in that exact moment, you will remember the still water, and you will do the one small thing every sage in every land was always pointing at. You will stop stirring. You will let your hand open, the way Odin let go on the tree, the way the good man let go of everything he owned and stepped into the boat. You will let your breath go long and let the surface come back to rest, and you will trust for 3 quiet seconds that what you need is already down there in the deep of you and rising to meet you. By morning, the old certainty will have closed back over you, of course, the sure feeling that nothing rose in the night, that the water is empty, that you are exactly who you always were, and the still pool was only a bedtime story. That is just the surface of you beginning to stir again with the noise of a new day. There is no quarrel to have with it. All that is left to do is come back here, the next night, and the one after that, and let the water settle again, until the settling stops being something you do and becomes something you are, and the knowing comes up so easily you forget it was ever hard. That is why the sage went back under the sea each evening, not to leave, to go down into the deep where the knowing lives, and rest there, and rise again in the morning carrying a little more of it into the light. You're doing the very same thing tonight. You're not losing the day. You're going down into the deep to rest, the way the teacher did, so that you can rise in the morning carrying a little more. So go down now, the way he did. Let the day close over you like calm water closing over a swimmer who has stopped fighting the tide. Feel the weight of you sink, slow and unafraid, down past the churning of the surface, down past the reaching and the guarding and the long noise of the day, down to where it is dark and still and holds you completely. The 7 sages are turning in the stars over your roof. The spring is rising under your floor. The teacher is resting in the deep, and so are you. You do not have to come back up tonight. The knowing will keep. It has kept for 5,000 years, through floods and fallen kingdoms and every wall ever built around it, and it will still be here, rising gently under the floor of you when the light returns. For now there is only the deep and the dark water, and you sinking softly into sleep, remembering without a single word everything the teachers ever came to say. That is the thing the priests were most careful never to say plainly. Not that the knowing was precious, which everyone could see, but that it could never actually be cornered, because it does not live in the temple. It lives in the deep of every person who was ever born, the rich and the forgotten alike, and the temple was only ever built over one place where it had been seen to come up. Remember the richest king in the world, crying out the wise man's name from the top of his pyre, finally understanding that all his heaped gold had bought him nothing of the one thing that mattered. And remember the poor engraver, with no gold at all, into whose steady hands the oldest story on earth quietly rose. The grasping king lost everything. The empty, attentive man received everything. There is no resentment owed for the long con of the walls and the temples, only a kind of quiet smile, because it was always going to fail. The water was under your floor the whole time. It is under your floor right now. So let me hand you, at the very last, the one short line the priest pressed into the clay and guarded for 3,000 years, the line that has been moving under every story tonight, now that you are soft and heavy and most of the way gone. It is only this. What the sages came to teach, you were always meant to remember. Not to learn, as if it were foreign and far off and belonged to other, greater people. To remember as if it were yours, and old, and only waiting under the surface for you to go quiet enough to let it rise. You do not have to do anything with that now. You're going to do something with it tomorrow without trying, and it helps to know where. It will come at the moment you catch yourself reaching hard for the thing you are sure you do not have. The closed hand around the phone, the grip in the chest before you walk into the room, the churning the second you imagine the money, or the person, or the proof that you finally matter. That grip is the surface of the pool being stirred. It is Adapa reaching for the careful, frightened thing and missing the gift in front of him. It is the king counting his gold and seeing nothing. And tomorrow, in that exact moment, you will remember the still water, and you will do the one small thing every sage in every land was always pointing at. You will stop stirring. You will let your hand open, the way Odin let go on the tree, the way the good man let go of everything he owned and stepped into the boat. You will let your breath go long and let the surface come back to rest, and you will trust, for 3 quiet seconds, that what you need is already down there in the deep of you and rising to meet you. By morning, the old certainty will have closed back over you, of course, the sure feeling that nothing rose in the night, that the water is empty, that you're exactly who you always were, and the still pool was only a bedtime story. That is just the surface of you beginning to stir again with the noise of a new day. There is no quarrel to have with it. All that is left to do is come back here, the next night and the one after that, and let the water settle again until the settling stops being something you do and becomes something you are, and the knowing comes up so easily you forget it was ever hard. That is why the sage went back under the sea each evening, not to leave, to go down into the deep where the knowing lives and rest there, and rise again in the morning carrying a little more of it into the light. You're doing the very same thing tonight. You're not losing the day. You're going down into the deep to rest the way the teacher did, so that you can rise in the morning carrying a little more. So go down now, the way he did. Let the day close over you like calm water closing over a swimmer who has stopped fighting the tide. Feel the weight of you sink, slow and unafraid, down past the churning of the surface, down past the reaching and the guarding and the long noise of the day, down to where it is dark and still and holds you completely. The 7 sages are turning in the stars over your roof. The spring is rising under your floor. The teacher is resting in the deep, and so are you. You do not have to come back up tonight. The knowing will keep. It has kept for 5,000 years, through floods and fallen kingdoms and every wall ever built around it, and it will still be here, rising gently under the floor of you when the light returns. For now, there is only the deep and the dark water, and you, sinking softly into sleep, remembering without a single word everything the teachers ever came to say. You do not have to do anything with that now. You're going to do something with it tomorrow without trying, and it helps to know where. It will come at the moment you catch yourself reaching hard for the thing you are sure you do not have. The closed hand around the phone, the grip in the chest before you walk into the room, the churning the second you imagine the money, or the person, or the proof that you finally matter. That grip is the surface of the pool being stirred. It is Adapa reaching for the careful, frightened thing and missing the gift in front of him. It is the king counting his gold and seeing nothing. And tomorrow, in that exact moment, you will remember the still water, and you will do the one small thing every sage in every land was always pointing at. You will stop stirring. You will let your hand open, the way Odin let go on the tree, the way the good man let go of everything he owned and stepped into the boat. You will let your breath go long and let the surface come back to rest, and you will trust, for 3 quiet seconds, that what you need is already down there in the deep of you and rising to meet you. By morning, the old certainty will have closed back over you, of course, this sure feeling that nothing rose in the night, that the water is empty, that you're exactly who you always were, and the still pool was only a bedtime story. That is just the surface of you beginning to stir again with the noise of a new day. There is no quarrel to have with it. All that is left to do is come back here, the next night, and the one after that, and let the water settle again, until the settling stops being something you do, and becomes something you are, and the knowing comes up so easily you forget it was ever hard. That is why the sage went back under the sea each evening, not to leave, to go down into the deep where the knowing lives, and rest there, and rise again in the morning carrying a little more of it into the light. You're doing the very same thing tonight. You're not losing the day. You're going down into the deep to rest the way the teacher did, so that you can rise in the morning carrying a little more. So go down now the way he did. Let the day close over you like calm water closing over a swimmer who has stopped fighting the tide. Feel the weight of you sink, slow and unafraid, down past the churning of the surface, down past the reaching and the guarding and the long noise of the day, down to where it is dark and still and holds you completely. The 7 sages are turning in the stars over your roof. The spring is rising under your floor. The teacher is resting in the deep, and so are you. You do not have to come back up tonight. The knowing will keep. It has kept for 5,000 years, through floods and fallen kingdoms and every wall ever built around it, and it will still be here, rising gently under the floor of you when the light returns. For now there is only the deep and the dark water, and you sinking softly into sleep, remembering without a single word everything the teachers ever came to say,